All right, the recording didn't miss too much. But what I was saying is that sociologists have really good theories. I like to think so because I've picked what I've picked. But in some ways, I also have always been very critical of the fact that as important and as foundational as a lot of what we will learn in the next few weeks is to how we understand unemployment, poverty, and crime, or these phenomena together in place, a lot of that is informed through a very urban centric kind of story in sociology itself. Now, this largely comes from the fact that University of Chicago is one of the heavy hitters in terms of social sciences, broadly speaking. But when we think of sociology, has anyone ever taken a theory class in here? A social theory class? Okay, okay. And they usually they have classical theory and they have contemporary theory. I don't like either much, but contemporary theory is a little better. And that's the stuff that, when you look at it, is usually stuff that's based in America post 1900, I would say, give or take. And that is coming out of the direct access that University of Chicago sociologists had to the surrounding area of Chicago. And actually, well before it became a place marked by extreme adversity, actually, they first started studying it when it was a vibrant community. And it informed how we understood social organization. It informed how people related to one another. And this is somewhat of a not necessarily a departure, but if we think of classical sociological theory as being the big three, Weber, which looks like Weber, not the grill, but Weber, Durkheim, and Marx. He's my favorite. They all kind of suck a little because they're built on the assumption that I, as a UROC, would not be here someday, let alone using their tools to hopefully intervene in my community. But if we take sociology as the way that we as academics have decided to study the social world, we have to kind of make a hat tip of sorts to the intellectual heritage that comes from a place like University of Chicago that in turn shapes how we 100 years later still think about some of these really core questions of sociology. And if you are sick of hearing about Chicago, I'm sorry, it's going to go on for a couple more weeks because still to this day, many of the landmark studies started in Chicago, or they at least use it as an important case because of how much it has meant to the intellectual heritage. So one would say, let's say we've decided, okay, we made our peace with the fact that a lot of these concepts are based on urban areas. Maybe there's room to expand and extend them, but we are also looking at urban places for a reason. And why is it that we would look at them the way we will in this class? That's what we'll spend a lot of time today and next time building the foundation for. And I'm going to lean on the fact that I do have a couple people in my class before, so some of this might sound familiar, might sprinkle in questions. But why, I'm going to open this to everyone though, because this is kind of just a good question. Why would we study neighborhoods? Like why, of all the things we could study, if we're looking at urban spaces, why is neighborhoods the kind of unit of analysis that we've chosen? What kind of comes to mind? Why would we look at that as opposed to the city as a whole? Or just cutting it right down the middle, which sometimes is what happens. Go ahead.
Certain areas have different diversities with different ethnic groups.
Yes, yeah. And if we looked at these places, I think one could say there's a bit of a chicken and the egg phenomena. You're like, well, did these patterns exist there before? Are they a reflection of the people who live there? How do we see such persistent patterns, even as we know that over time, the people, the individuals and their choices, et cetera, that's constantly churning. People are moving, people are coming in. So the phenomena must be something greater than the individuals themselves. Now, that in and of itself is a deeply sociological question, because if we think of what is it that makes sociology different, in my mind, as someone who ironically spends a lot more time talking about trauma and things that are in the brain, sociology, though, is the enterprise of trying to explain things at the unit above the individual, but at the same time, explaining individual behavior to a certain extent. And if we know that the individual choices and the individual people are changing, why is it that we would see such persistent trends, both positive and negative, across time and space? Now, in the urban inequality literature, we see neighborhoods being, in many ways, the kind of next, if we think of cities broadly speaking, neighborhoods could have similarities across the city, but that's almost like when we take the census data, for example. In some ways, this is both cultural, but also a reflection of structure, that when we study these places, the data goes down to the level of the neighborhood and the census tract. And actually, what kind of sucks is a lot of what we know is bounded to the census tract. And so in this class, as we are learning more about the trends, it's kind of a natural question to be like, well, would this apply in a place like Merced? Does this stick to places in the Central Valley? That is very much TBD, because just as much as the trends might be different, the idea of a neighborhood itself is also, it has different meaning, right? Has anyone ever been to a city and been walking a city block? Right? Have you ever been to different cities, or even just downtown Merced, and they're like, oh, this is a block. And it's like, I've walked a block in a city. This is a different kind of block. Like spatially, it's actually different too. Well, so we see not only is the city structurally, spatially different, but then those units have different meaning. And in some ways, I guess it's sunk costs. They started studying neighborhoods and they designed a census to study neighborhoods. And now if we want to study neighborhoods, we must study the census and vice versa. And so a lot of what we'll be learning about in this class is kind of talking about these differences that in some ways it's hard to see the line. Why would you see such a different school experience here and then a mile in the other direction vastly different, either positively or negatively? Where is that line and why does it have meaning is actually something you'll be pondering and will get a chance to think about in your own lives. Because if you've grown up in a place, urban or rural, you probably have a sense of different parts of your community having a different vibe, flavor, or even way of doing things, like structurally really mattering. Now, we've decided we're going to study cities. And so we have to study neighborhoods. That's just how it is. Why is it? I was like, we're going to come back to this, but has anyone ever heard of concentrated disadvantage? Or the word paradigm, just by itself? I was like, we're going to be saying the word a lot today. Paradigm, I'm seeing some nods. What is a paradigm? Like, just to put it out there. Anyone know? It's hard to describe first hint. It's like, I have a slide for this. We'll come back to it. But I will say, I was just listening, obviously, to the SZA album. And on the Saturn song, I'm pretty sure it's one of the lyrics in the first chorus. I'm sick of this paradigm. And I'm like, God, that's a hell of a word to just be busting out in a song, but I respect it. Now, if we look back at sociology as this like intellectual enterprise over time, we have to really give our due to the fact that it wasn't always concerned with trying to describe disadvantage, even though a bulk of our time in this class will be looking at outcomes that we would hope would improve through policy intervention, et cetera, et cetera. As I said, this actually is almost urban inequality is a subfield of the larger kind of urban sociology, where cities are where we were looking, with the Chicago School chiefly being the big example. And then you have the landmark book, Black Metropolis, published in 1945 by St. Clair Drake, which essentially describes a vibrant, bustling, incredibly economically prosperous city that Chicago was directly after when we think of the Civil War and then the Jim Crow era, and how sharecropping, segregation continued to be a thing well until the 1900s and mid-century. The experience of those in the Deep South was not only something that shaped their community in those geographical regions, but was also something that they took with them as they moved to different places. If they wanted to, in some ways, if they wanted a different life, they had to leave the South. And so the Great Migration is a process from roughly 1910 to 1970, where you see generation after generation essentially migrating north to work in the Rust Belt or in car manufacturing factories. The manufacturing industry, was much bigger once upon a time. And in places where we now see this extreme inequality, it is quite galling, or it's important to know that this wasn't always as such. And actually, the extremely concentrated disadvantage we see in these areas is almost a reflection of the great prosperity that was once there. But as time went on, almost if you think of a lake or a creek when it dries up over time, if you're lucky, you can still see the outline of where the lake was, you can still see where the water line was. And in a way, the experience that we see in the urban literature looking at inequality and disadvantage, broadly speaking, it's set within almost a bomb going off, because this community was actually something that was almost a reflection of generations of wanting to overcome extreme subjugation in the South and being able to build a place where Black families could be middle class, but Black families could be upper class. They were business owners. They were public officials, political leaders, et cetera, et cetera. And in that context, we see the extreme fallout of deindustrialization in the 1970s, where no matter who you were or where you worked, it was very rare that a manufacturing plant survived what was extreme layoffs, entire industries collapsing. At the same time, technological innovation is changing. So even things that maybe once took more manpower take less. And why this matters is that as this city was so prosperous, it wasn't due to, college educations. It wasn't due to advanced credentials. It was actually all the more special because the people who were able to do well and support large families and be prosperous and start to accrue wealth, they were largely people who graduated high school or less. But because of the they call it a tight labor market. If anyone here's done any economics, I ran from it. But slack economies are when there are way more applicants than there are available jobs. So when you go to apply to something, you have to rise to the top tenfold. Whereas if we're in the opposite, where there are a lot more jobs than people to work them, the bar is pretty low. You can work in anything, and as long as you're good at your job, you can do well. And so there was multiple generations that had experienced this migration, but then also building in place and had the very reasonable expectation that they would go on to work in the same industries, in the same jobs, and have the same ability to prosper as the generations that came before. That sounds familiar, right? That's the American myth. That's what we're all supposed to have access to. And for generations, that was true in places like Chicago. But then a huge macroeconomic shift takes place. To sum it up in some ways, the things that were happening to individuals, as much as they were changing lives and their household budgets and all those things, they were actually gears shifting at much higher levels, even beyond industry. When we think of, I want to say it was oil prices coupled with something called stagflation in the 70s, which kicked the legs out from many industries. And then we saw many of those jobs be outsourced and not returned back to places where previously labor had been cheaper. Central cities were designed to facilitate the industry that had centralized in those places as well. And so when almost overnight, the jobs that people had grown up thinking they would do because grandpa had done it, dad had done it, I'm going to do it, I've prepared my whole life to do it, that job doesn't exist anymore. And while for one person, it was one job, when that happens to everyone in a community, when it's happening as a universal experience and it's not going away, it becomes unemployment into joblessness, that is where we see how work was not just a matter of making ends meet for any one person, but also a social phenomenon that structured how people relate to one another, how they relate to themselves and their time. And so that is in many ways where we see social scientists turn their attention. Because in the same places where once there had been extremely vibrant wealth accumulation for those who had historically been deprived and marginalized from such opportunities, we see in a matter of years, the tables turn. And in the place of jobs, when entire communities lose their tie to employment and to clocking in, or at least the social organization that goes with being formally employed, you still have mouths to feed. You still have people to take care of. You have to find a way to do those things. And when work disappears, shout out another book name, you see this kind of social transformation, and not for the better, where other things, both licit and illicit, black market opportunities become commonplace in these communities. And whether it's drugs, or what if it's just, I work under the table, I fix cars, I do landscaping. There is a different economy in this space that's also impacted by public aid recipients and the accumulation now of generations of not having work. This is not just an individual experience, though, because these areas are simultaneously divested from by the cities. They're ignored. Some would say that people are almost concentrated to these areas. And so that's where this paradigm of concentrated disadvantage comes from, where we see sociologists essentially trying to describe the fact that place is concentrating outcomes, specifically negative ones: poverty, unemployment, and crime. Those are the big three. When we combine them together, they have concentrated disadvantage. And it was an experience that problematized a lot of what we had known about social class and resources being strictly a racial phenomenon. Because in these communities, there had been a vibrant Black middle class. There had been a prosperous economy. There were things that would have been traditionally theorized as evidence of a post-racial climate. Now we're talking about something that happened, what is it, 1970, 60 years ago, almost now, a long fucking time. And we're not post-racial now by a long fucking shot. So the idea, though, that in some ways it was the prosperity and the fact that there was a vibrant Black middle class, there was a Black upper class, that this was happening despite these being the children and grandchildren of slaves or slave descendants, that was really heralded as a high watermark. But then when in less time all of that was gone, and we see much more dangerous things take the place of formal employment, that's when it almost becomes a different kind of chicken and the egg. It's like, well, if jobs are what left, if we brought jobs back, would this all go away? If everyone tomorrow had the job of their choice and the money they needed, would this all go away? Not quite that simple, because it's one thing to lose your job. It's one thing to be struggling to find work and to be unemployed. But when you opt out of seeking formal employment, when that switch goes from trying to become formally employed to pursuing other ways to make ends meet, and then joblessness becomes more common than not, the strings that everything else was tied to goes with it. And I will say that you guys have the benefit of learning from, if we, sociologists like to tell you the intellectual heritage of things. So if the University of Chicago was a big deal in sociology, there was a man who wrote the book we're reading in class, William Julius Wilson. He is a man still. I owe him an email, but I need to finish my book, and I'll send him an email like, Big Bill, I finished it. But he is essentially the author of the books that would spawn many, many more books. If we think of a father of a discipline or a subfield, that is who William Julius Wilson is to all of this. And the book that you all read in this class, More Than Just Race, is the book that I was reading as a freshman in my first winter at Dartmouth, thinking, God, this place is snowy and I hate it and I miss home, but I'm going to be tough and I'm going to stick it out. But I'm homesick. The homesickness was real when the snow was on the ground. And then I'm reading about the south side of Chicago, wondering why there are experiences and people that sound like home in such a radically different place than one I had grown up in. And I really ran with that. I always say I had a tiny shrine to Bill Wilson. And then when I was picking grad school, the only reason I was going to go back to the snow again was if I got to be his student. And so he had the honor of not only his work, but then going on to be the mentor of everyone whose book we'll read in this class, or many of the authors that we'll learn from. He was their mentor, and I am his last student because he retired when I finished up, and my defense was the last defense he ever went to. And I have always said that my hope in my work is to take Bill's work where it's never been before, the reservation. Because I do think a lot of the things he illuminated over time and with the help of others, these concepts, we can't, as sociologists, purport to say we know how poverty works, we know how dysfunction works, we know how crime works, if we haven't included the reservation into those considerations. And while some of it sticks, a lot of it is different. And it's not that the theory before is less than, but instead a chance to expand it, to theorize the social world as a whole and not just the urban world, which is a really bad bias of sociology to say that we studied it in a city, so that must be how the rest of the world works, right? I don't think so. I'm from the forest, I'm biased, but there's a lot of places in between. And so in this class, we are taking tools that were designed to study a very specific phenomenon in a specific place, but at the same time trying to theorize, what does this mean for social organization and for how people relate, broadly speaking. This is me and Bill, as well as Judge Abby, who we'll have the chance to learn from later this semester. God damn. This was, I would say it's 2025 now. I think it's 10 years ago, maybe later this year, but yeah. There's me 10 years ago, and I always laugh because someday, oh, you guys can't tell in here, my hair's gray. I dyed my hair gray for a bit. It's always funny. But if I can have it look like Abby's gray someday, it's a win. But this is Big Daddy Bill, Judge Abby. I am their brain baby, and we are trying to take what we know and apply it to other places. But in this class, we are going to kind of be sticking to urban spaces, but you get your chances in your own work to maybe apply this to where it sticks in places where you know. But as I was saying, this is not, even though we will often look at the experiences of individuals, we're trying to explain in some ways things that are very much shaped by individual choice, whether that is looking for work, whether that is the experience of incarceration, prisoner reentry. We know that personal choices as well as extreme structural disadvantage are at play in all of these circumstances. And so that's actually kind of what is novel about the concentrated disadvantage paradigm, is that in these places, if it was just a matter of people's personal choices to not seek work, or just a matter of their choices to commit crimes, or I was like, I don't think there's any poverty. I guess they just like to spend their money and not pay bills. That's not how any of these things work. If you know firsthand, you know that to be true. But there are we could say facetiously, the devil's advocate, or the idea of theoretically, if we suspect any of these choices to shape the outcomes we're studying, how is it that we explain such persistent outcomes and trends over time, even as the people, the individual people, will inevitably shift out of the thing we're looking at, right? People get older, people die, it's a thing. So like the fact that we're seeing these trends in place is kind of indicating that there's some kind of mechanism above and beyond the individual that is actually sustaining inequality. And that is, as I said, something that we have to appreciate as a process that happened over time, with in some ways a very discrete starting point, while at the same time now being a process that is all in some ways self-sustaining, that there is almost what has been called reverse causality, that the thing that prompted all of this wouldn't necessarily, if it changed, might not necessarily impact any of this anymore. Or the thing that, if we think of X causing Y, right? Or I guess X causing Y if it's you guys. Y is, I was like, that's messing me up. Y usually doesn't cause X. But if we think of unemployment and its relationship to criminal activity, there comes a time very quickly where it's hard to discern which way the arrow goes. And on a theory level, that's important, right? But it's also important if we think of how do we impact these things? How do we impact crime? How do we make the impacts of incarceration or prisoner reentry, how do we intervene on any of that if just giving them jobs will no longer fix that, even though we know the loss and complete lack of jobs was integral to this whole process starting. So what we've decided as sociologists is instead to try and explain things like violent crime by stepping back from previous generations' focus on values. Oh, that people commit crimes because they have deviant values and they value these things, or they don't value the things we value. We're putting that down because it's bullshit, and we'll learn more about that next time. But it is unfortunately something in an ethos that kind of colored a great majority of early scholarship. And so Bill was kind of throwing his hat into the ring of trying to describe how culture could still impact phenomena, but at the same time holding space for the role of structure in shaping behavior. That as much as economists, not that I want to throw too much shade at them, but some disciplines really put the emphasis on personal agents and how everything we do is a matter of rational choice, and we add it all up and we make our decision from there. If you've had a life as such, that's quite nice. Some of us were born into a rock and a hard place. So the choices we had access to were never things that we had full access to, and instead were very much a reflection of the structure and the time in which we come up. Now, in chapter 1, we see him try and paint this discussion because in some ways it was very poorly done. And so people almost avoided the fact that both structure and culture could be at play. They avoided it like the plague. Now, what do we mean when we say social structure? Like, because in some ways we're trying to explain, poverty, unemployment, crime. These are all things that we can all think of examples that are either a reflection of personal choices or circumstance. How do we parse these things apart? And so social structure in this class and in this paradigm is referring to the way that social positions, social roles, and networks of social relationships arranged in our institutions, such as the economy, polity, education, and organization of the family. Like that is social structure, the things that we interact with daily, things that actually live inside of us, because it's how we conceive of ourselves and others, but also things that live on the outside and structure our world in very real ways, even if we can't always tangibly put our hands on them. By comparison, culture, on the other hand, refers to the sharing of outlooks and modes of behavior among individuals who face similar place-based circumstances, such as a poor segregated neighborhood, or have some of the same social networks as when members of a particular racial or ethnic group share a particular way of understanding social life and cultural scripts that guide their behavior. Social actions, social processes aren't one or the other. They are instead a combination of both. And so in this paradigm, we are trying to explain behaviors and outcomes above the unit of the individual while still holding space for agency, for culture, the things and the choices that we decide to do autonomously, but then also the walls that we run up against. Now, phenomena is a word that you're not supposed to use a lot, or phenomenon, because I mean, feminine phenomenon, what's feminine nomenon? I can't say that word fast, but that word is a cool word. But in sociology, when you're writing, you're supposed to be specific. And so when you use the word phenomena, it's like there's probably something else you mean, and you're using a word that's got a real long letter count for space. But it's also, we're talking about things that are like way up here in the meta. And so sometimes we got to use that word because we're talking about macro level. We are talking about how things like stagflation or the changing costs of oil would happen such that 3 generations of a family that had accrued wealth and prosperity was gone in a generation or less, above and beyond the individual choices of any one family member. That is what concentrated disadvantage in this urban inequality enterprise is trying to do. How do we explain the linkage between these macro level things and variations in micro and meso level outcomes? Now, this has largely looked like unemployment into long-term joblessness, or long-term jobless, excuse me, into joblessness, where when, census data, I'm sure you guys have heard sometimes things like the poverty rate in the country or the unemployment rate's gone down under so-and-so's presidency. He gets to take credit for the unemployment rate being at a whopping %. That number is only calculated based on those people who are actively seeking work. It does not capture people who are no longer seeking formal employment, who've opted out of the formal economy, and who are long-term joblessness or long-term jobless for a long term. That phenomenon, when you've just opted out, and what if it's not just you opting out? What if your children, like they aren't thinking about pursuing work formally because they didn't see that in the home growing up. They saw different ways of making ends meet, and that makes more sense in the conditions in which they find themselves. That's where the process becomes joblessness. And in time, we're seeing a concentration of poverty, and in a kind of chicken and the egg fashion, these communities were in many ways marginalized and segregated in place, and now they are hyper surveilled. And, high crime may or may not be it might be happening more in these places, but we also look at them a lot more. We cover the ground with more people to get them in trouble and to catch them up. So when we look at mass incarceration as somehow related to crime, we also have to realize that not all communities are under the same level of surveillance. Not all communities have the same experience with the criminal justice system. And now in time, the things that were once a byproduct of the long-term joblessness become further fodder for it. Now, in the instance of places like Chicago, because they were seeing a phenomenon that was varying by race and place, it was clear that class was the mediating factor. That while race was a huge part of the phenomenon, largely speaking, when you were explaining the differences intra-racially, you were looking at class. And what does class mean? What does class represent? What do you have access to as class changes? Now, if we were trying to explain culture, I'm not gonna lie, we're gonna save this for next time because I want to talk more about culture next time. We'll come back to that. But chapter 2, if we think of, well, no, I guess it was culture. We'll touch on it. We'll dive deeper next time. Do I want to? What time is it? No, next time we're doing a deep dive into culture, so I'll have a couple remarks, and then you guys are gonna do some cool stuff together. So yeah, we'll save that. Because I do think, you know, we can talk about culture, and we will, but we also have to hold space for like the very real forces that were concentrating people into certain places. That as much as there was a great migration and we could see people, you know, if your cousin moved up here, you're gonna move to that same neighborhood. It just makes sense. There was also a phenomenon by which even if you wanted to live somewhere else, you were forced to live in the central city. Redlining being how we've termed that. Has anyone ever heard of redlining? Okay, what is redlining? Well, how would you force someone to only live in a certain place? What does that mechanism look like? I was like, Gavin, right? Go ahead.
Redlining, generally speaking, refers to dividing up cities so that only specific groups of people can buy housing, for example, in certain parts of the city that's designated for them, while usually other groups have their own separate housing, usually upscale, nicer areas of the city.
And this is, oh, go ahead, go ahead. Yes. Exactly. Right. And this was in a time where we are seeing Black families have access to resources where traditionally they may not have. And so we have to realize that as much as the Black metropolis was a reflection of this wealth accumulation, it was also designed in some ways to be serving the larger structure, that there was jobs in these manufacturing plants that they wanted people to work in. And so by constraining people to certain neighborhoods, it also meant when those jobs went, the whole neighborhood came crashing down. Now, I'm going to check in on chat because it looks like we've had a couple points. Oh God, they've been answering. My bad, guys. Good answers to the questions. And yeah, so we've got when areas in urban areas are considered redline, is that also a form of concentrated disadvantage? Absolutely. And that's actually, there's not enough weeks in the class, but if there was a way to add 2 more weeks, but not actually, I would add a week entirely about housing and a week entirely about immigration. We touch on both in different weeks because they are often simultaneous to other processes, but redlining, and in some ways, if we look at the books I lined up here earlier, now I've talked to them both. They love each other. There is no beef. But once upon a time, these books here, especially right here with the American Apartheid and When Work Disappears, although they now can be kind of reconciled into the same theoretical kind of thrust, they briefly kind of argued that one mattered more than the other. And so if you were a Wilson and a employment, unemployment scholar, you were talking about the impacts of deindustrialization and how extreme and major that had been. And not that the rest wasn't important, but that's where you put the locus of change. Whereas if you were coming from an American Apartheid, Doug Massey and Denton, Nancy Denton kind of wheelhouse, you were talking about the fact that it didn't matter what kind of work anyone wanted. When they came to the city, they were forced to live in certain places, and they were segregated as such that the outcomes could only inevitably impact them more because of the way they were concentrated. Now, in both of these instances, race is the mediating factor, and there is a divergence of outcomes both across races, but then inside of a racial group as well. And so over time, the nuance between race and class becomes kind of more fleshed out, even though for many instances, right, these things go together, but they are also operating at different levels and in different mechanisms. And so I would say generally these things live in the same wheelhouse now. But if you look at this as a list of all the things that right now could both be cause and consequence of this historical phenomenon of joblessness. All of these things now are in and of themselves, like they were caused by that, but now they're causing it or sustaining it further. And so what we do actually over the course of the semester is essentially go through each of these layers to talk about the value added on the kind of inequality at play, but then how has this changed over time, and how are schools uniquely contributing, or how is mass incarceration both, a response to these trends, but now adding fuel to the fire. Now, ultimately, if changes in the economy did not result in huge changes to our life across the board, perhaps in a non-capitalist world where we weren't defined by our ability to clock in somewhere and we just had meaning and worth and access to life in and of itself, we can dream. Check out my other class. But let's just say we weren't hooking work to everything else so strongly. Maybe we wouldn't see shit roll downhill like we did. But instead, because of the way employment, in particular, formal employment, clocking in somewhere, because of how that was structuring life entirely in these places and in most places, because again, capitalism, when you see this huge macroeconomic shift take place to work, you also see a huge implication socially speaking. And so in communities where we saw jobs disappear, and in time, people with the resources to move away and follow the jobs, that meant that those who were left behind were almost further concentrated. They were more likely to have less access to resources. They were less likely to be close to any kind of formal employment. They weren't seeing it modeled. They were maybe in proximity and participating to things that would be further damaging to finding formal employment. In either way, you see a concentration effect that produces what has been called social isolation, whereby concentrated poverty is essentially increasing the likelihood of social isolation from mainstream institutions like work, school, etc. This is joblessness, dropping out of school, lower educational achievement, involvement in crime, unsuccessful behavioral development and delinquency among adolescents, non-marital childbirth, and unsuccessful family management. In general, the research reveals that concentrated poverty adversely affects one's chances in life, beginning in early childhood and adolescence. So your parents not having a job is one thing. In the places we've studied, that one thing ends up being connected to a whole host of other things. And that is usually poor academic achievement, poor access to academic resources, and neurologically speaking, even differences in cognitive ability, emotional regulation. These are things that I myself am learning about in my own life in real time, but it accumulates somewhere, even though it's accumulating in the brains and the individual experiences. The beginning of the story starts well above and beyond the individual. Now, if we are like, well, is it just a matter of where you live that's doing all this? In some ways, kind of. The expression you can take so-and-so out of the whatever, but not the whatever out of the so-and-so. I was like, I don't want to name names. The res out of the girl out of the res. That ability for place to be sticky, if you remember that word from last semester from my class, we're going to come back in week 5 about what it means. But essentially, we, over the course of generations, because that's what more than just race is, that's like decades of work synthesized into the easiest reading version of books and books and books. If you're like, well, how would we intervene in this? Would it just be a matter of moving away? Sometimes that is absolutely a way to kind of break the cycle and change things. But we have shown that actually, even if you move away, whether you're growing up in an affluent neighborhood or a poor neighborhood, it is highly likely that whatever neighborhood you came up in and your parents were raised in, you will go on to live in that same neighborhood. And that is obviously very much against the kind of American myth of each generation doing better than the last. And more often than not, the generation before is dictating the generation to come. And that it is place and space that is kind of the mechanism transporting these outcomes across time, even as different people and different choices, right? You know, we're not our parents. I'm not my mom. I'm making different choices. How is it that we would still see people winding up in similar circumstances? It's because of this larger structure, right? And the fact that place and space are what it gets stuck to. Now, we will also in week 14 touch on what if we tried to intervene at that level? What if we moved people to different neighborhoods? Would that change the outcomes we see? That is incredibly expensive. And it sucks that that's always the reason not to do it. But they've done it a few times. And what sucks is each time they did it, it didn't change enough to make that huge amount of money worth it. And so instead, it begs the question, why do I have to leave home for better? And as a tribal person who comes from a reservation community, you've always wanted me to leave this place. I see how you are. You're going to make it so I can't live here and thrive here. So inevitably, I will have to leave. So why can we not improve places in right where they're at? And so we're going to look at different ways we've tried to do that later in our policy interventions week. But as we have, we're going to end it here. If you have questions, this would be the time. This is one of my least favorite classes because the amount of, I'm just reading my eyeballs. It's okay. I do that too. Take it in, let it wash over you. But next time, it's going to be the reverse. I'll have a little bit on the front end, but you guys are going to spend most of your time together because I want you to dig into this idea of structure and culture. And where do I, as the human, as the agent, where do I fit into all this? So be ready. Next time we have a big activity. We won't start quizzes till next week though. And some of this will come up though on next week's quiz. So make sure you're keeping up on your readings and we'll see you next time. If you're on Zoom land, I have attendance, but I am going to enter it in now. If you have questions, hop on, but we're going to clear the room first and I'll be on mute while I do that. Alrighty, there's quite a few people still on. Maybe I'm just playing in the background, but if you have questions, you're more than welcome to say it into the mic. We've got just a couple people ahead of you in the room, but I just want to let you know you are officially in line. But if you're just chilling, we're officially done. Hi, Veronica. I see you're here. I am gonna start packing up, but how can I help? Is there anything today? Maybe I'm just in the background vibing. I think I might just be in the background. Last call, Veronica. Do you have any questions? All right, be in touch if you do. We'll see you next time.